All right, looks like we're live. Welcome back to Conversations from the Underground, episode 16. Again, it's me, Eric Salas, and my compadre, Dr. B. What's up, man?
How you doing?
I'm doing good. It's been a minute since we touched base after spring break. Understandably so, we all took our break. We took a break away from delivering our weekly episode. And so we're back.
Kind of got
Uh,
extended a little bit, huh?
a little bit. We took that break for sure. And then we went a whole week of classes, and so here we are. And just getting back at it. But it's been good. The break was good. I needed it. What about you?
Man, it never seems like a break. It just seems like a transition from one thing to another. More time invested in something else instead of another one. Um, I mean, it was good to be able to work and then uh, kind of not have to be in certain places at certain times. I was able to kind of get more done, but spent a lot of time filling out grants, gardening, doing a lot of work over there on campus, building this little gardening center that's been pretty interesting, man. Probably since spring break, I've kind of got to the point where I put in a little bit of work every day when I first come in, and I put a little bit of work in on my way out because I park over there. You know what I mean? And so I've been doing more and more work over there, less in the office, trying to maybe prepare for the transition of no longer having that space, possibly.
Mm.
Um, I don't know. We'll see. Supposedly, you and I may be able to get one together, but we're still waiting on that. I mean, I know we still got some months for a while before it actually, goes into effect. But I'm a long term thinking kind of guy. You know, I mean, I got to start preparing for stuff when I hear the change. You know.
Yeah. That work you're talking about is the work on campus, though, right? Not like a side gardening
Yeah, I
project.
mean, I've been doing some work. The grants and stuff have been with Southside Community Garden, the
Mm.
nonprofit that I mess with, or one of them. But on campus, I'm just building this gardening center. I don't know really what to call it yet, but this multi-purpose area that has um, walking trails. It's got food growing everywhere, trees, aquaponics system, different types of gardening. And there's a bunch of stuff over there. So I just kind of go over there and utilize a bunch of bricks that are just sitting there that nobody's using. So I'm making a path with them. There were a bunch of 100-gallon tanks just chilling over there by the bee um, spot uh, as you come in from the 360 um, entrance to campus that were just chilling there, not being used. So I got the truck, picked them mugs up, took them over there, and now I've been working with Lori Erdl. She's learned how to
Mhm.
do this. What do they call it? iService requests. So we got to put all this stuff into iService requests. It's
Okay.
ridiculous how much time and bureaucracy they got to do. Where I'm just like, man, I just go out there and do it myself. We ain't got to worry about
Right.
all of these hoops that people have to go through to be a legitimate institution in this country, or maybe any country generally. I don't know, but it just seems so absurd to me. Like,
Hmm.
we want to get something done. Let's get a group of people together and just go out and do it. But you got to like apply for this stuff. You got to fill out the application. You got to put in the iService request. People working won't do anything unless they get this ding from another group. I don't know. It's interesting how the capitalist society that we live in creates these like specializations, meaning this is what I got to do all day long, and I can't do anything unless I get the code from, you know, this is my lane, and let me just cultivate that lane type of thing. It's interesting because, you know, I've been doing some research on this lady, Elizabeth Briotti is her name. She's an anthropologist who came to UTA, and my son, I went with him to her presentation, and he did some interviewing with her. Like she's what they call an applied anthropologist, a cultural
Okay.
anthropologist who studies work. So she worked for GM for like decades, and she just got research to do whatever she wanted in terms of investigating things. She just go into what they called it, a worker setting in a factory, and she'll just observe and hang out with them. And then she noticed that people were like blaming each other, and she connected this to the problems of inventory and figured out a way to fix this kind of stuff. It's very interesting research that has been on my mind a lot lately too. So yeah, man, it's a lot of work, lot of different dimensions, a little bunch of different threads going in every direction for me. You know,
Mm.
you feeling like lifetimes go by in a couple weeks with all the things going on.
Yeah, man, for sure. Um, yeah, I know. This past, well, I won't say this past weekend because it was a day or two ago. I was at my little boys had this assembly, and the assembly was like this musical performance where they were, the theme of it was called Yankee Doodle.
Hmm.
And on top of that, this past week, I remember looking at an article from the Wall Street Journal, and their concern was revolved around like American values and how they're shifting to a degree. And I thought that was interesting. What the article ultimately was leaning towards, what it essence was saying about America at large, like how our current values may not reflect where our values used to be, and as to whether or not if that has any like bearing on where we're going as a society. Um, I thought that was interesting, and I felt that there was an interesting not comparison, but maybe just a point of perspective as I saw my 9-year-old boys on a stage singing Yankee Doodle
Hmm.
daily. Um, and it, obviously because that, brings up this notion of patriotism and whatnot. And I wondered, does patriotism matter anymore? Like it used to. And the reason why it's making me think about this more than ever because I have to bring it up of course I'm bringing it up in class. I brought it up in class because, um, we're discussing the American Revolution. We're discussing what it means to be a patriot. Um, and I'm asking my students these questions, and very seldom are they willing to give me a response um, as to what it means. And one I wondered, does it mean that you love your country? One student said, no, it simply means that you need to be loyal to your country. And then I asked the other question, um, can you be loyal without love? And then another student said, yeah, it's called your job. And
Uh-huh.
he's like, I'm loyal to my job. I don't love it, but I am loyal to it. And man, it made me think a lot about, what we're teaching, why we're teaching it. Uh, do our students have the values to appreciate maybe what we're teaching? And if the values are falling short that quickly, And again, yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen it. I think I might be able to show you um on this meeting, because you know, like how people share things on Teams and whatnot.
Yeah,
Yeah, I might be able to share it to you. Like you can share a screen, right?
you should be able to. What is it that you're trying to share?
It's the article from Wall Street
Oh,
Journal.
oh.
Yeah,
Hmm.
so I was like, uh, I think I'm able to do it here. Let me see. I can probably pull it up.
What was the title of that article? Do you remember?
Man, I don't know exactly what it's called. Let me see. One second.
Well,
I
yeah.
just typed in American values. Uh, typed in American values and then Wall Street Journal, and it came up.
Hmm. You know, yeah, I would say first, it's a good discussion to have. What are values? Where do they come from? How do they form? Are they universal or are they micro? Meaning, are they um, conditioned by certain aspects of lived experiences? Or are there superstructures that dictate values? And if so, can those structures be dismantled? How do they go about doing that? How do you replace them? These are all questions that I think need to be explored when we're trying to analyze this concept of American values, what they are, and do we have them anymore? Um, Patriotism itself, I think, is very interesting because um, to what extent can we argue that patriotism didn't exist in the minds of human beings uh, until, yeah, about the Enlightenment era, I would argue. I don't know. I mean, maybe um, you have to have this entity, a republic or some sort of government that you feel cares for you, is got your interests in heart in order to have a love for it, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Peasants ain't over here worried, loving the king in charge of something when they over here working their ass off all day long. Um, what does the 4th of July mean to the slave, as Frederick Douglass so interestingly pontificated on at one point, if you recall. That kind of reminds me also of this idea of where does patriotism come from? Who has it? Is it still useful? Can too much of it be a problem? Or what is fascism other than patriotism on steroids? Maybe. Um, I don't know. So these are pretty interesting questions. I don't mind exploring. And it kind of reminded me of that Elizabeth Briotti, who I was mentioning. You know, she
Mm-hmm.
wrote a book called Transforming Culture. She worked for GM with what she keeps calling, I can't remember what she called it, but it was like working funding, meaning the funding wasn't based off results, wasn't based off productivity or profit or anything like this. Um, she worked for these people for a long time, and then when GM was about to go bankrupt, they laid her off in like 2006 or 2008, I think it was. And she created her own company called Cultural Keys, which I thought was interesting. This idea that there are these tools that we can use to understand cultures. Cultures exist everywhere on a micro level. She discovered this culture by hanging out with these people in the manufacturing plant that developed in response to an inventory problem that the company hadn't fixed. But trying to survive this problematic inventory situation led them to create this whole underground culture of hoarding certain parts and going to people and then blaming certain groups of people to cope with trying to deal with a problem that they were not responsible for creating.
Mhm.
It's a very interesting kind of thing that on a larger scale kind of makes me think about how culture influences our understanding of values.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely has an influence. Um, when I ask my students about values in general, I shared the values that were identified in the article. And then ultimately I had to ask them, where do you get your values from? And most of them are readily acknowledged, I get my values from my family.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to ask them, okay, well, do you respect those values because you love your family members or because you're loyal to your family members? And of course I was playing upon, what was recently said, as we, is it possible to be loyal without love?
Mm.
And, one student was like, well, yeah, I love my folks. That doesn't mean I'm always loyal to the values that they share. And that ultimately, there's a culture within the family.
Right.
And then there's a shared culture within the neighborhood. And then there's a culture within the city or the town or, whatever community you identify with. And those all play a role in a larger culture. And for sure, the diversity of America makes culture even harder to identify with or align yourself with. When we look at a community that's made up of Hispanics, Africans, Chinese, people from the Middle East, Hispanics, and so forth and so forth and so forth. There's a multitude of culture there. On top of the influence of language, religion, socioeconomic status, and whatnot. And those will all play a role in one's culture. And despite those variables, there's got to be some common features or common threads that we identify with as a nation. And not just simply us alone, but then other communities identify with as well. So, how does our community, how does our culture, when I say that, the American culture, view, and again, pulling from the Wall Street Journal, patriotism? How does it view religion? How does it view having children? How does it view community involvement? How does it view money? These are all like these generic and broad concepts that should be applicable not only to America, but of course to any community, whether they're in the United States or not. So it's something that we can all relate to. And when I was looking at the numbers, it says here in 1998, and again, I wish you could see my screen. I was trying to figure out how to share it, but I mean,
I
obviously.
can see it, but it's so
Oh, you
small.
can. Oh, really?
Yeah. It's hard to kind of
Oh,
make out from the screen. Now I can. Now it's no longer there, but I
oh,
can
it's
read.
no longer there anymore. How does it look now?
I mean, it's there, and you may be able to watch it when we go back and look at it. But from my point, I can't tell. The text is
Well,
small.
then yeah, don't worry about it. But maybe I'll throw it up later as like a file attached to the
Sure. Yeah.
presentation or whatnot.
Read
But
it.
it says here patriotism was, it looks like maybe like 65 to 68% in 1998.
Mm.
Okay, in
And what- yeah.
1998 it was 65% to 68%. The percentage who say these values are very important to them. Very important to them. Fast forward to 2023, it's under 40%.
This is about patriotism as a
That is
value.
correct.
Yeah.
Yes, very important to them. Religion, slightly above 58%. In 2023, it's slightly below 40%. Having children in 1998, about 59%. In 2023, about 25%.
So look, let's take these things here and use them as an example of a model of how culture and values are formed. What was the first one? First one was patriotism. The second one was what?
The second one was religion.
Religion, and the third one was children.
Having children.
Yeah.
And the other two were community involvement, and the last one was money. All four of the first ones I've mentioned experienced an incredible decline. Community involvement, the largest decline, the steepest decline. Only money has had a gradual increase.
It's probably increased forever.
But I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, I think that is very much interesting. So, like on the one hand, we could argue when a society, the more people that start to populate the earth, the less maybe people think there's a need for production. Not to mention also that the higher education people have, the less children they want to produce.
But generally, education has been on an uptick anyways, historically.
Right.
Also, population has been on an uptick generally, historically anyways.
Yeah, but it's an exponential growth, right? So it goes fast and fast. And now, coupled with all this talk about climate change, could be something that sways people to start acting and behaving differently, which can shape values, right? So sometimes values are formed in response to a need that exists in the world that you interact with. If you need people to cooperate, you are probably going to think it's important to have more kids, to develop larger, more communities. That's one thing. Another good example with the patriotism kind of idea. Perhaps the more educated people get about being exposed to different perspectives of the past that were not as accessible as they are now, could deter the emotional attachment that people have to this government that they feel an imagined community to. However, I would say, there was no patriotism really very much at the beginning. The American Revolution was not a very patriotic war. The vast majority of people didn't fight because of patriotism. The government that they created after the end of the war was very anti-patriotic. It was very anti-government itself. It took a very long time, years. In fact, we may be able to argue that it wasn't until the War of 1812 that you really start to see more objects of attachment that Americans have to bind them together and make them think in a homogenous group. And then yet we still go through a devastating civil war that kind of showed different patriotic loyalties and different perspectives. And then after that civil war is when you see the real naturalization, and you see like national parks, you see national postal systems, all this national stuff. The word national is all over the place. And people maybe felt as though this fragmented country maybe needed some hyper history that was very selective, that glorified the past to try to connect people together. But the problem is, after the civil rights movement and the great democratization of education and more people getting exposure to some of the contradictions of the nation's past could deter them perhaps a bit from being patriotic.
So if that's the case, you're making the argument that the acceleration of access to information in this current generation has exposed many more to some of the not inequities, but the limitations of our so-called patriotic symbols, resulting in a lot of people simply saying, "Yeah, that doesn't mean a lot to me anymore." And again, I want to stress this: in that Wall Street Journal thing, this was no longer being a very important value for them. Doesn't mean it's not a important value. It's just no longer a very important.
Right.
So it's like, the highest of importance. It could
Right.
probably still be a value, but it definitely doesn't carry the same weight that it used to.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, we kind of hinted a little bit about this in my History 1302 class today. We talked about, I'm sorry, History 1301. We started like the Old South, which I define as like 1808 to 1860. And we talk about like plantation culture. And I bring this book by Ulrich Phillips that was published in 1916, I think it was, and republished several editions afterwards. And like, if you read what this guy says, it's just utter racist jargon. I mean, he's talking about like Africans cannibalizing each other and how great it was for the 12 million to have made their way across the Atlantic, and even better for the few 100,000 who made their way into what would be known as the United States. No mention of the brutality of it whatsoever. And then you give them like, I brought Eugene Genovese's book Roll Jordan Roll in there, which is a very provocatively and opposite of that version. And you're like, you look at these two, look at how much time is separated from them. I think matters in the type of interpretation that they're providing, right? And it's like it's not just access to information, it's also a battleground of ideas that is constantly being waged for influence. And I think there are more people's voices being heard publicly that make convincing arguments about some of the the degenerate or degrading forces of U.S. American culture.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not as glorified as we like to make it out to be. You look at what they used to say about the Spanish American War, and look at what we say. Maybe Vietnam was the first one that really began because there was this growing countercultural movement that began to kind of like see these things, expose these things constantly. Activists, constantly trying to shine a light on some of this stuff. Before, people didn't really mention much.
Right.
A couple 100,000 civilians die under Teddy Roosevelt's watch in the Philippines, and he gets a Nobel Peace Prize. It's maybe a little bit different back then than it is,
Yeah. But patriotism wasn't the only value. That's just one.
Right.
Religion, community involvement. What was
That
the other
one's
one?
one to me, because I would think
Having children.
The community involvement one is interesting to me, because it's been, for me personally, it's been opposite.
Mhm.
I've been involved in a lot more community, whereas I wasn't at all earlier in my life. And so I see community involvement all around me now, whereas I didn't previously. So to me, it seems like it's constantly there, which is maybe one of the reasons why it kind of strikes me as shocking. Which kind of shows how your lived experience and your own bias, your own cultural lens, the time in which you're living, has an effect on the way you see these things. Because
Right.
I thought that would have been different.
Not always
Um,
reflective of the reality, just simply
yeah,
because we experience it.
and religion has been like this. I mean, for a while now. I mean, the United States has always been somehow more religiously inclined than Europe. Um, some have argued that it's only a matter of time before people start kind of abandoning these kind of superstitious things. You know, uh, we tend to attribute less to a higher power
Hmm.
once we learn more about its functionality. That's not to say
Hmm.
that there are still not issues that aren't worth philosophically debating about metaphysics and the world beyond the physical.
Hmm.
Uh, but to sort of feel as though we have this perfect picture of like a humanized entity out there that's like a father or a son or a unit family just walking down the street talking about hi. You
That's
know,
funny, man.
it just
It's like humanized entity. That's
it's
funny,
funny. I
man.
got to get up with my mom one day. I remember we were talking about this. I'm like, Mom, so you think when you die, you're gonna just be able to know all this stuff? Like, you don't think you know who you are? Like, what happened? People be losing their mind and they're alive. They don't remember who they are. So we know that your mind is biologically dead, right? Because you can you can go dementia
Oh
if
man.
you don't know anything. If your mind messes up, if your mind ain't working right, then your identity and your understanding of it don't work. So when that mind dies, how you gonna bring that with you? Um, I always have these debates. Religion's always been interesting for me because I grew up
It
very
gets reborn.
sure.
Um,
Sure.
hey, by the way, can you see my screen a bit better now? Or can you see me at all?
Yeah, I see you kind of like in the bottom right corner with me, and
Okay,
then
because
screen I
I'm
see
trying to
chart.
fix it to where you don't see me at all. And I'm hoping you just
Oh,
see
I
the
mean, I see
chart.
this more now. It's like it says patriotism, religion, having children, community involvement, and money. Uh,
Perfect. And then you see the arrows, right?
Years, is that right? That goes from
Yeah,
1998.
they're
Yeah.
they're making a clear distinction, it looks like, in 2019 and now. I think it's, because they want to identify how much of this may be influenced by the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a drastic decline for patriotism.
And
Uh,
even more drastic for community involvement.
and I wonder to what extent, if you took these polls in times after colonialized, colonial-esque wars, if you would see a trend like this. I mean,
Okay.
when you spend a lot of money and going into war for things that people begin to see maybe weren't necessary, or people didn't like that, as opposed to like people thinking, well, we went to war in World War II to save the world, so people are like, yeah, that mattered. But what were we
Yeah.
doing worlds? I don't know. That's an interesting deal.
And I think for the sake of context, you know, polling data is, I guess one could argue, a relatively, new form of understanding research and science. I mean, we haven't really done polling that long. Even this right here, they're
Yeah.
suggesting that they've done it at least for 20, 30 years. Is that long enough? You were saying, well, I wonder what the polling would have been around, colonial um, colonial establishments of, maybe American empires or whatnot.
Yeah.
I don't think we were polling back then.
Right.
And then if we were, who? And then could we argue that, you know, some of their case studies were limited because they didn't poll enough people? You know, we don't have a really um, a strong base to determine as to whether or not. And in the same vein that, you know, when you look at early anthropologists, many of them were still under the gaze or the spell of a Eurocentric perspective.
Definitely.
So we can't really value, or I should say, we have to always utilize that knowledge with a grain of salt. I think the same would be said for early polling.
Yeah,
It's
I know.
nowadays polling, people do, you know, don't get me wrong, we can always manipulate a multitude of things. But man, a 30-year, I mean, it's 30 years, or 25 to 30 years here of polling, and it's showing a fairly significant decline.
And maybe if they'd have taken that poll a couple months earlier as opposed to a couple months later, how drastically would it have been? I don't know. And another thing that always comes to my mind when I see polls, I'm like, ain't nobody ever called me. Until motherfuckers start calling me, maybe I'll start seeing some of these polls being real. But I ain't ever been in no, hello, sir, I'm wanting your opinion on blah blah. Who they come up with, man? Um, I used to work for this place called Probe Research in the mall when I was in high school.
Hmm.
And us, you'd randomly grab somebody and you'd be like, "Hey, can you come fill out this survey and watch this or play with this thing? I'll give you $5."
Right.
And nobody be showing up. I'd be up in there making up stuff. Turn it in, $5 here, go. Right. Like,
Look,
how,
I got 10 surveys. Give me
how,
$10.
how many people were doing that? Like, man, yeah, everybody likes this movie. Really? Like, man, who knows? That's why I'm always as a
Well,
coach.
we would like to think if the we again, we would like to think reputable, you know, newspapers like the Wall Street Journal would, you know, vet their sources,
But
create
it's the
some.
nature of the source material that's the problem. That's what it's this. That's the what do we call that? Quantitative data, sociological studies. As a cultural historian who's all about interpretation and perspective and these types of things, man, I don't place value in any of these things. I just don't. Maybe it's a
Mhm.
flaw, and I should be paying closer attention to them. But I don't operate on the assumption of some trend that supposedly exists through some group of people polling some random people. I
Mhm.
just don't. Um, maybe again, maybe it's because I didn't focus on a lot of that stuff. I don't have much training in it, so I don't know the extent to which it works. But but I have read a lot about even how science can be deeply flawed. We've talked about this before with that Thomas Kuhn book on the structure of scientific revolutions. Um, one powerful, influential individual can make tremendous intention. That person's intentions can have tremendous influence on the outcomes of a lot of these things.
Mhm. And not for nothing, very seldom do I use polls as a way to gauge the temper or the temperature or the tenor of society at large.
Mm.
Very seldom do they stick with me, with the sole exception of maybe a poll regarding the popularity or the value of an individual like Dr. King,
Mm.
where towards the end of his life, you know, if you as they were polling individuals, hey, you know, so what are your feelings towards Dr. King? They were relatively high, you know, right around the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Closer to, you know, his assassination, after making remarks on the war in Vietnam, after making remarks on questioning whether or not if he led his people into a burning building regarding
Mm.
uh, the civil rights movement and its nonviolent direct action component. His polling dropped tremendously. The American people were not necessarily as supportive or believed in the dream anymore. So
Mm.
that always held space in my head on how this country viewed the civil rights movement initially, and how the country viewed the civil rights movement towards the end of the decade, right around his assassination. The polling was very low. Of course, the polling was low in the beginning because nobody wanted change. And then once they experienced once I guess America was under the spell of Dr. King's dream, they felt that that could be a reality.
Mm.
Shortly after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we're still experiencing a great deal of turmoil with the rise of Black Power, riots in Newark, Watts, the assassination of Malcolm, and then ultimately the assassination of King and then Kennedy. It seemed that America was in the dumps, if you will. They're polling towards this notion of a greater America seemed very low. And the personification of that would be very low polling for Dr. King.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I don't
But
deny.
outside of that, I don't
Well, I
pay
mean,
much to polling.
a lot more examples. I mean, I'm sure that there's a lot to be deduced or understood or revealed or learned from polling data. The problem is, how many times is it not? How many times
Right.
for each one of these studies? How many times is it been uh, highly skewed by some particular subjective aspect that wasn't accounted for? Or to what extent does a snapshot in time, which a poll essentially is, right? To what extent does a
Right.
snapshot in time help us truly know what that means on the broader scale for uh, some cultural aspect of a society? Um, it could be that people change their mind about something quickly. There's moods. There's so much going on. I don't know. It's interesting to think about. Um, I do think.
But to change your mind so quickly on, I mean, would you argue? I mean, is it not safe to assume that these would be like pillars of values in American society? Like patriotism would not be a a pillar. Um, Community involvement would not be a pillar. Money not be a pillar. But money is the anomaly here because it's trending upward. Um, but religion not be a pillar.
It's a good question. It makes me think. What is a pillar? And
Well,
to what extent are there such things as these cultural foundations? Maybe by pillar.
well, the pillars uphold an even greater object. So, for example, you can't have, I mean, or you could, but you still need a foundation. The foundation would be freedom. Upon the foundation of freedom, you have various pillars that erect or uphold something even greater, the ideal. We utilize these pillars like patriotism, religion, uh, children, which we could argue is the future. Community, our respective, brother and sister, and then money, a tool by which we use to measure quality or quantity or whatever. And then from those pillars, we exalt something even better, which would be the ideal of America's existence. And this isn't just simply an American thing. I would argue this is this would be akin to any civilization at any time. But it's all on the foundation. You could have a pillar without a foundation, but then it's soon to fall. The foundation will always rest. And as I ask my students, what is it that you think that is central to the identity of America? They all say freedom. They all say freedom. But again, that foundation may have a pillar to exalt something new or something better or something higher.
But what if your foundation is an illusion? What if this notion that you have of freedom is deeply connected to the deprivation of a freedom for some?
Well, no, they don't deny that either. The argument was that that is an ideal. So an ideal is somewhat of an illusion. An ideal is something that's not real. It's something that you strive towards. You never really achieve it. But it's something that you're working towards every day. We can all understand that if this country presents itself as a country of freedom, equality, and justice, well, when has all people ever experienced that? And you would say never. But that doesn't mean we don't try. And that doesn't mean we don't try to extend access to those three items with every new generation. That's why it's an ideal. We strive towards it, holding ourselves accountable to it. And the pillars enable us to achieve this. And these are why we call them values. Without values, you're never going to achieve that ideal. This is my concern. Are we a nation without values? Are we turning into a nation without values? And apparently, there's only one value on the 5 that were listed, or 4 or 5 that were listed, that we can all get around, and that's money. For real?
Well, that's very American from the beginning.
Yeah. Economic freedom.
Why did this? Yeah. Again, I don't want to use this word because it's not the exact same thing, but what keeps coming to my mind is George Orwell's concept of doublespeak in that book 1984. Yeah, there's this stuff you're talking about, how maybe it's not cheap, people are striving for it, or maybe it's the utterance of these phrases themselves are deeply coded with the contradiction. So maybe they're attempts to convince yourself of the exertion of power over others.
Like doublespeak implies like work is freedom.
Yeah. Or, we just got finished watching this documentary in my class too about Abdul Rahman, who when he was purchased by this guy, Thomas Foster, who is this illiterate, this illiterate farmer who knows next to nothing, happens to buy this guy who's a prince, who knows how to make cotton. And when he tries to explain to this dude that he's a prince from Africa, the guy names him Prince to kind of laugh at him, to make fun of him. To what extent is this foundation of freedom in a way like that? It's more to kind of show and expose and dangle in front of the people who you've deprived of such freedom, this torturous thing. Maybe it wasn't the core value, freedom. I mean, maybe money was the first and ultimate core value. Sure. This notion of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is a very important book that comes out the exact same year in which the Americans decide to declare themselves independent. And the idea is that there's a more efficient way for people to make more money for themselves. You call it pursuit of happiness and all this other stuff, but really what you're talking about is we can give more people individually in their hands the way to make their own money, um, and participate unobstructedly by this government, um, which began with an aversion towards government based on money.
Right. And that's fair, but that all implies that you said the unobstruction of government. That means to be free from their restriction.
Yeah, right.
Well, that's freedom.
Yeah, but
Like I can't make money if I'm not free to make money. I can't make money if I'm not free of taxation. And I'm not free to assemble if there has to be this supervisor at every meeting. I'm not free. I don't have free speech if I can't hold this individual accountable.
But at the same time, you're going to force yourself to have a supervisor over them enslaved people, or at the same time, you're going to do right. So there's like,
well, we're not without contradiction, and I'm not opposed to the notion of being hypocritical. No, we can be hypocritical, but hypocrite like I can have value. I can have values and still be hypocritical. Those don't wash away my sense of consciousness. Dr. King, you could make an argument that Dr. King was hypocritical. Was he a man not of value or a man of values? Of course he was. But just because we can identify an element of hypocrisy doesn't negate or eliminate and wash away levels and elements and tiers of value. They're going to exist. And I would almost argue that, and don't get me wrong, like when I talk about the American Revolution, I speak to my students about Animal Farm, where we have a revolution against one tyrant and unfortunately gets replaced with another. You know, we say we don't want excessive government, we don't want excessive taxation, and then here we are with
doing
you know, a whiskey tax 25% higher than the tea tax was.
So that what to me that says is that's you weren't very interested in freedom in the first place. You were just interested in power transformation. That's hypocrisy. I don't think you can accuse Dr. King of hypocrisy because of what I'm assuming maybe sleeping with somebody. That would be a mistake that he made, or impulse control, or maybe something else is going on and he probably feels bad about it or feels guilty about it. These fools ain't feeling guilty about what they're doing. I would say hypocrisy is when you say something deliberately that you know you're not going to go with, that you're doing it for this alternative agenda, maybe, as opposed to making a mistake or making a stupid decision or acting upon emotion at one point in a situation. You know what I mean? Whatever the
entanglement.
Case may be. Yeah, an entanglement, whatever the case may be. You know what I mean? We got to make distinctions between those grades, I feel. And the United States never had any intentions of treating Indians free. Like from day one, it was issued that we need to get moved. They had never had intentions of liberating Black people. Maybe you could say this about Jefferson and Notes of the State of Virginia. There's some strange phrases there that show some guilt, that maybe is trying to justify in my mind to make me kind of convince myself that this thing that I know is probably not good is necessary. But all those others, those paternalistic, positive, good people, the concept of freedom for the white male landowner, and then the white male, I mean, that's a different form of hypocrisy. To me, that's foundation maybe is hypocrisy and money.
Mm-hmm.
And all these pillars fit in that.
That's a tough foundation to sell. Hey, I got this foundation of hypocrisy. Build a house on it. Yeah. But I do ultimately, and I agree with you. Don't get me wrong. There are some elements that I agree with you on, because ultimately I do explain to my students the concept of democracy. Now, like, if you talk to most people that may have never, I don't know, didn't delve deep enough into history, they'll probably think that we live in a democracy. We hear the word democracy so often. But democracy is an illusion. And, and that's interesting. I remember it sounded like you said something earlier that people believe in these illusions. Democracy is one of them. It's an illusion of inclusion. We throw the word democracy around because we want people to feel like they have a say, when in reality, we live in a republic where you don't.
Right.
Because you can't find the word democracy in the Constitution. You can't find the word democracy in the Declaration of Independence. You won't find democracy in I Pledge Allegiance. Democracy doesn't exist in this country, but it's thrown around so readily that many people tend to believe that we live in one, and we don't. And again, the question we should be asking ourselves, well, then why are we throwing that word around so liberally? And again, it's because we want people to believe that they're involved and that they have a say, when in reality, that's never been the case.
Yeah, man, I agree with that. I'm thinking maybe money is the foundation and hypocrisy is the pillar now. It
looks like if that's the case, the foundation's doing well, according to the polling.
Yeah, ain't never been. I mean, one thing that I think there's no debating is that the United States of America is the richest country ever to have existed. In terms of how many people are able to accumulate massive amounts of wealth. I don't know the number, but I do know that 200 people in the world have more wealth than the bottom 50% of the entire world's population. Right. I don't know how many of those 200 belong in the United States.
Fair amount. Or capitalism works for a few,
but I'm pretty confident that it's mostly
as you were referring to the founding fathers as a select few of individuals fighting for their own individual freedom, never extending freedom to natives, never extending freedom to those that were enslaved. That's the same scenario right now. Capitalism benefits a few, to where you have these individuals that have amassed so much wealth. Elon Musk could lose 20 billion and still be the second richest man in the world. He's lost 20 billion and he's still not blinking, batting an eye at the fact that he's lost more wealth than 50% of the population could ever amass in their lifetime. So yeah, that is true. However, this is interesting, and I'm not sure if you've been paying attention to the conversations regarding BRICS.
Regarding what?
BRICS. Have you heard of it?
BRICS.
BRICS is this new economic organization made up of China, Iran, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. It's a new economic coalition where their goal is to replace the US dollar with the Chinese currency,
Mhm.
and that all of their trading and interactions will now take place utilizing that economic currency. I'm not sure if you've heard of that. It's been
Faintly.
whirling around in the political world. And by the way, Mexico has submitted their application to join BRICS.
What does it say? Well,
say again.
what does all this mean? I would say we're starting to see the reality that world historians have been telling people all the time, that what goes up must come down, that nothing is forever, that empires fall and rise. There's a great book by Francis Fukuyama called The End of History, where he made this argument of how the United States and American exceptionalism sent this message that we sort of figured out the recipe and the code and the direction that all people should go, and that history is now over. It's just a march towards what the United States has figured out, that everybody, the path that you're supposed to take to be successful in life. But we understand now that culture doesn't operate like that. There is no one path. Culture is a byproduct of our lived experiences, combined with the collective memory of those who came before us, that we tap into as we experience the world and interpret what we're feeling and thinking, and then react on that. And it changes quite significantly. People become overly protective of parts of their culture that perhaps would otherwise not be considered a good idea, but after being condemned or ridiculed by an outsider, they embrace. Why? Because culture is very complex. It molds itself to its environment in ways that we may be seeing occur right now. Less Americans adhering to values that may have been considered traditional American values before there were things like technology that bind people together across the world more. You got people in America who got best friends in China they ain't never met in their entire life. They just sit there playing video games all over the place. It's hard to get them to want to hate these people when he the one that's the bad guy on the computer with them every day.
Yeah.
There are all these different factors that people's time are being spent on that are rearranging their values. Our values are a byproduct of what we spend our time doing, and how we end up making sense of the world around us. And if the things that we do change over time, the values are going to change over time. At the same time, there's a sense of hubris that world dominant powers tend to gain or have that ultimately culminates in their collapse. And you could very well be seeing both of these things kind of working together to maybe create a cataclysmic or seismic shift in history. We don't know. It's hard to say. And what's ironic about all this stuff, man, is like, although I'm not patriotic, you know, like I probably live in the best time, in the best country ever to exist, you feel like, because we can sit here and have these conversations. I ain't got to worry about all this kind of horrible things that people have had to deal with. But that's right there, kind of culturally, you know, here I am as a cultural historian saying you need to be, everybody thinks that they have their cultural lens makes them think that this is the way it is. And still you end up with that feeling at your core that I'm glad I live now instead of in the medieval ages, you You know what I mean? Or whatever the case may be. Even though there's problems, which is
You'd be a
why,
heretic.
you know what I mean? It's like, and it's why I hate this concept of like you're ungrateful, complaining about America, stuff like that. It's like that's not what it's about, man. You see issues, you address them. That's a different. That doesn't mean I'm not happy that I live now instead of being burned at the stake. What it means is I live and I exist in this society and I see problems and you highlight them. Maybe it's because we also our purpose for history is different now. We learn history. I think people tend to say so that we don't kind of make some of the same mistakes. When history came out as a profession, it was more like we learn it as it actually occurred and we glorify it maybe and utilize it for rallying up the troops, whereas today
It was
theory.
For sure. I mean, it's used. It was in some places it's still used as a tool to unify us under a common narrative.
Right. Yeah, because you can't have history without a narrative, they say. Right? I mean, history, you can't have a people without a history, maybe I should say, they would argue. If you want to have something that unifies people, you have to have a history. Is initially how this whole nationalism kind of came about was to try to bind people together. But now that we see how much brutal interactions have occurred under the flag of the nation state, then we can kind of say, well, let's use this as a learning tool to explain something about humanity, how capable we are of getting involved in bad things if we're not vigilant enough to think about our actions logically. I tell that to my students a lot. Like in 1302, we just got to the rise of fascism. So I talk about what causes fascism, right? And so I'm explaining to them the importance of taking logic classes so that you can learn how to spot fallacies and fallacious arguments, because fascists can gain a lot of support through emotion and willpower, and that a lot of you will listen to how I say something more than what I say. And if I can say it passionately enough, you may believe it. Or if I can get an important person that you respect, like Michael Jordan, to come up here and be like, these Wheaties are good for you. Like, this food don't know nothing about no nutrition, diet, doctor, talking about Wheaties, but you know Michael Jordan, so now you want this. Like, if you understand the fallacies that exist, then you can maybe protect yourself more from this vulnerability that we have as humans to want to belong to this particular group. And nationalism can become a problem when we spend so much time glorifying our accomplishments and sweeping our transgressions or mistakes under the rug. Well, we'll then just keep continuing as if they're not mistakes. And maybe more people are starting to see that now. I don't know.
Yeah. And if that's the case, I don't think these other countries that I've mentioned are lowering their patriotism. Meanwhile, we may be doing that. I don't think, so if you want to talk about Iran, you think that they're having a slump in patriotism? You think in Russia, are they having a slump in patriotism? In China, are they having a slump in patriotism? For the United States to see this, this fall or this decline on these values, as much as we can make an argument we shouldn't have those values, I guess time will tell. Time will tell. Man, we ran out of time, or we went over time.
Yeah, for real. I've been trying to think about a quote here. Um, Man, there's a bunch of different ones that I just running out of time, but I kind of like what HR he's known as. He was the lead singer for Bad Brains. Paul H.R. Hudson at one point said, "Whatever the mind can conceive, the mind can achieve." And to one extent, I think maybe that fits a little bit with a lot of what we've been talking about here about how what we think we ultimately end up doing and being. The communities that we conceive of as being important and valuing, we end up doing it. But then others can come along and help us conceive something differently that may shape or switch our value system.
For sure. I tell my students all the time, and it's not like a unique quote. It's just something that I always say, especially when we're discussing, monetary value, what backs our money. When I talk about relationships, I always tell them value is where you place it.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's not terribly too far off of what quote you said.
Yeah.
Whatever the mind is able to conceive, the mind is able to achieve. And value is wherever you place it. So if you value your relationship, well, then it has value.
Right.
If you value money, well, guess what? It has value because you put it there.
Yeah.
Now, the moment you deprive it of value, well, then everyone else will devalue it, and you'll see a ripple effect of that. The moment you begin, and if we can have a collective value, then that gives it an even greater sense of worth. And this worries me if we as a nation are seeing a decline in every form of traditional value with no opposite increase in other values that we tend to or and I don't care if they're new, let them be new. Sure, I don't mind the values changing, but man, we got to have something better than money.
It's funny that this in one of my 1302 classes this semester, I was talking about the Great Depression. I'd make this point about how your money ain't valuable, and I pulled out a $100 bill. I was like, "You see this $100 bill? This ain't worth anything. I mean, it really is not worth anything at all. That don't mean I'm going to go just give it to you right here, though, right? Why not? Because I imagine that it is, and we've kind of agreed to operate under this system so long and so strongly that I give this thing value, right? I imagine it is valuable so much that it actually becomes more valuable than it really is, because if the zombie apocalypse hits tomorrow, I'm gonna be burning this mug to start a fire.
It hasn't, and even when you don't give it value, that's okay as long as everyone else values it. And so most Americans don't value their money. No American goes to work and says, I think my job pays me too much. Most Americans go to work and say, this job doesn't pay me enough.
Right.
So right then and there, what are you doing with your money? You're devaluing it. The same way that if you walked into your bedroom and your partner's laying on the bed and you go, this relationship ain't paying me enough. Well, she'll probably think you're devaluing the relationship, understandably so. But even though Americans don't value their money because we always want more, that's okay as long as the rest of the world continues to do what? They value our money.
Yeah.
But BRICS is now telling us we're getting close to the point where, we don't need your money.
Yeah.
And that is something we should be worried about. But
Yeah.
we'll see, man.
Station.
We'll see.
Cool,
All
man.
right. Gonna stop it for the day.
Yeah. We'll catch up next week.
All right. Take it easy.
Easy.